So today we have a guest on My Uncle's Escaped Alcatraz, and his name is Roderick. Art was a U.S. Marshal for years. He is retired now, and he worked with Ken and Mike when they were both researching a book and was also on the television series and helped work on this case. And so, Art, thank you for being on the podcast. And why don't you start off by just telling us about yourself and telling us about your illustrious career in the U.S. Marshals. We just talked a little bit offline. We know we have a similar friend who worked in the U.S. Marshals. Yep. So tell us a little about yourself.
Well, I spent almost 40 years in local and federal law enforcement. Spent 3 years in the military as an active duty MP. Then 3 years as the local police department up here in Massachusetts. And 25 years with the U.S. Marshals, retired as the assistant director in charge of investigations for the agency, and spent 2 years at the Department of Justice working in the criminal division, helping them train foreign law enforcement partners overseas. And then I worked for another 5 or 6 years for Department of Homeland Security, with the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, representing them at Homeland Security headquarters in Washington, D.C.
Wow. So you've been in government life for a long time.
Long time, yep.
So let's dive right in here. How did you first meet Ken and Mike? And then what is, as far as you're affiliated with the Alcatraz story?
Well, let's start with the Alcatraz story because that happened first. The case was actually turned over to the U.S. Marshals in 1979 when the Attorney General at that point in time shifted what's called the escape and rescue statutes from the FBI over to the U.S. Marshals. And this was one of the cases that came over in a batch of cases. Unfortunately, all we got was about 3 or 4 pieces of paper, which were generally the judgment and commitment of the individuals, and then the warrants themselves for escape. My first lead I worked on in this case was in 1988. And since then, I cannot even estimate how many leads I've done on this case since 1988, and actually still working on it now.
So tell us a little bit about when the case was first brought to you. I mean, what was your reaction to it? This is like a decades old escape case. You know, obviously that's what U.S. Marshal does. You guys hunt people down, but like, did you even think that it would have that you'd have to do anything else on this case?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, they were still, we did a lot of stuff back then in the late 80s, early 90s. We profiled on America's Most Wanted, which obviously produced quite a few hits. And I truly believe that, and I'm going to jump way ahead here, but I truly believe that I probably talked to Fred Breezy in 1993 when that case aired, because he actually was the one that told me about this farm in Brazil. But at that point in time, AMW, America's Most Wanted, was basically, you make a call into the studio, it's anonymous. You don't have to give your name. You don't have to give a callback number. And that's what Fred actually did. He never gave me any information where I could get back in touch with him. So, there was several leads that I had conducted back in the late 80s, all the way through the 90s, 2000s, up until now.
Wow. Fantastic.
So Fred Breezy, you think, called in to the anonymous tip line, and what did he? What do you think? I'm sorry. Let me rephrase that. So what did he tell you?
He told me that he knew the Anglins, that he had grew up with them, and that he had seen them down at this farm in Brazil. And he tried to explain to me exactly where this farm was. It was pretty difficult over the telephone. I took down as many notes as I could. But he described basically what we found out later when I worked with Ken and David, that gave us the audio tapes and a Polaroid photograph of Breezy telling the family basically that whole same story all over again. And I think it was around that same time frame, Ken, if I recall too, that Breezy had come over to your mother's house, I believe. and sat down with the family and told that story.
Yeah, he was actually at the Anglin family house in Ruskin when he met with the family in '92.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was around that same time frame, and I think his motivation for
That was
doing
my
it.
next question.
Yeah, his motivation for doing it at the time is the White Star Line, which is the crew, the boats that take people out to visit Alcatraz, had put up $1 million reward for information leading to the arrest of the Alcatraz escapees. That more than likely was his motivation.
Oh, interesting.
$50 is a lot of motivation, especially back in '92.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Ken, what do you think about that? Do you think that was his motivation? I mean, because it was shortly after he spilled the beans to you guys and that family reunion. Do you think that's why?
No, that's not. I don't believe that was his motivation. I mean, me and Art, we don't always see eye to eye on every detailed piece of this case, but I just go based upon what he said to the family in '92. He did indicate that he was still in contact with the brothers at that time. He did also tell in that interview, and I say an interview, it's really more of a meeting. My mom recorded it, so I call it an interview, but it really wasn't an interview. But during that recording, he did state that he was in contact with them still in 1992. He did indicate that when he contacted them, he asked them, was it okay if he did what he was about to do, which was to tell his story. And he was getting, believe it or not, $1,000 from Inside Edition to tell the story. I have that Inside Edition tape that he did with them, but he didn't write them. The way that he communicated with them, according to what he told the family, was he recorded it on a cassette recorder. And that cassette then was passed down to someone else who then re-recorded it. And it maybe have gotten recorded several times before it made its way down there. When it came back, this is exactly what he said. He said, they told me it was okay. Do whatever you want to do as long as it doesn't come back on us. So I think, yes, he was motivated by money. I mean, he was doing the Inside Edition. He was totally broke after he got out of prison. And he was definitely doing it for money. I mean, he had no other means to make a living. And so, motivation was that, but it wasn't the fact that he was going to turn them in.
Yeah.
At least that's the way he came across to the family.
Yeah.
He was not trying to turn them in. And in fact, he even told us or told the family about, I don't know if it was Art that he was speaking to, but he did tell in that interview or that meeting that he did call in to a TV show. And he thought, this is how he said it. He came in from cutting grass. He saw it on TV. He thought the Anglin brothers had been caught. And so he called in. And when he called in, this is how he said it. I stepped in a bear trap. I stepped in their trap and they caught me. So, I don't believe he was doing it for the kind of motivation that Art might have been thinking. So.
Okay. All right. Well, Art, let me back up just a little bit. So when you first got involved in this case, I mean, what was the department's, what did they have information? Did you guys think that they were still alive? Or did you think that they had made it off the island? I mean, just before you even got involved in this case? I mean, what was the general consensus of how they?
We always, the Marshal Service, I mean, all of us that have worked criminal cases and investigations, we always have an open mind. So, and Ken, I think, can truly back this up that we've investigated every single lead that has come up. Maybe not to the liking of Ken, but we at least try. We've tried to investigate every single lead that he's put forward, that Ken has given us, and then every single lead that came about. My involvement in '88 really had to do with Don DeNeve, who wrote a book at the time, and I think Don was in touch with your family, Ken, at that time, and he put out a book. I think it's called Riddle of the Rock or something.
It is.
Yeah. And I had actually interviewed DeNeve a couple different times, and that kind of started my involvement in the case.
Interesting. So did you have any preconceived notions before getting involved in this case on whether or not the lore of Alcatraz, whether or not they got off and whether or not they died in the bay and all that stuff? What was the government's line of thinking at that point before you then?
I mean, reading through the FBI reports and the Bureau of Prisons reports, they believed that they drowned in the bay, which is fine, but, we never came up with any bodies. So any leads that came in that were actionable leads, we went ahead and investigated. And I mean, that's what we do. And at that point in time, as famous as the Alcatraz escape was, to me, it was just another old escape case. We have several old escape cases. So, when we don't give up on them, it might take us 10, 15 years to catch somebody, but, especially if they go overseas. But, we don't give up. It's still an open case to this day.
Yeah, can you kind of talk through the process of how the U.S. Marshals work as far as people who leave the country or escape and are on the run? How does that work as far as for those guys?
Yeah, generally what we'll do is we have representatives over at the U.S. National Central Bureau here in Washington, D.C. for Interpol. So Interpol is actually established over in Lyon, France. And there's about 160 to 190 nation members. They have several different notices that can be put out. A red notice means the individual is wanted. They have yellow notices. They have different color-coded notices for different types of lookouts. It could be an endangered child or a missing person. So they code these things differently. And what we would do is we'd open up an investigation through Interpol, provide them all the necessary information that we have on file for them, and then they would send out a red notice to all 190 countries that if they spot this individual, go ahead, he's wanted in the United States, and we would begin extradition procedures through the Department of Justice.
Now, at that time in the 80s, did Brazil have an extradition treaty with the United States?
I don't think they did back then. I don't. They do now, but I don't think we had. Brazil was one of the countries that you could flee to and basically not be extradited from, as I recall back then.
Yeah, Justin.
No, I was just curious. What were some of your theories about what might have happened to them?
The first thing was, okay, did they drown in the bay? And we looked at all that particular evidence that had come up at that point in time. Whatever they found in the waters at that point in time, we looked at all that stuff. I will say I was pretty impressed with the FBI investigation because they literally tracked down every single lead and then stayed on top of it months and years afterwards before the case got turned over to the Marshal Service. I know Ken has probably recalled coming in contact with probably some FBI agents way back when, as they were surveilling the family house and any type of. One of the things you do is, you look at funerals, weddings, birthdays, stuff like that, where there's always a possibility that an individual will show up or try to make contact with the family.
Was there any of that from the reports? Were they able to track any of that?
Well, I know they did a lot of surveillance, but they were never able to confirm that they was able to definitively confirm that there was any contact with the escapees with the family.
Yeah. So getting back to the extradition in Brazil, how does the U.S. Marshals deal with countries who don't have a reciprocity extradition treaty process?
A lot of times we can still get them back. I mean, we've actually got people out of mainland China before. So there is some stuff we can do, whether it's a quid pro quo type situation where they're looking for something, we're looking for something. But sometimes we can get the individuals out. We had one particular individual, he's a 15 most wanted case. His name's Peter Paul Zink. and he was in Guatemala. We knew exactly where he was, but he had gone ahead and married the daughter of the Attorney General. So there was no way we were going to get him out of Guatemala. So we waited for about 12 years or so, and the Attorney General ended up passing away, and we actually ended up getting him out of the country.
Wow, that's a lot of patience there. I mean, that's a lot of patience. So how long? I mean, what is the government policy? I mean, you guys just don't. If it's an open case, it's an open case, no matter how long. I know this one's kind of coming to a close soon.
Well, I wouldn't say there's a sort of an unwritten rule where we sort of, I wouldn't say the only way to get rid of the case altogether is you need the U.S. Attorney's Office to basically go to a judge and dismiss the warrants on the individuals. That's really the only official way to close the case. But we have ways internally within the Marshal Service where we sort of deactivate cases. I mean, right now, how old are they? They're in their mid-90s, and I think Frank Morris is probably 96, 97, somewhere in there.
98.
Yeah, so they're kind of getting close to the unwritten rule we have in the Marshal Service that once you hit 99, we kind of deactivate the case. Doesn't mean that we won't, continue if leads come in, but a lot of times we've actually found bodies, or found graves where fugitives have been buried. We actually had a case where we had this what we called fugitive safe surrender for minor cases, but we had an individual show up with an urn with his brother's ashes in the urn, who was a wanted fugitive. Of course, we couldn't confirm it, but we've run into weird cases like that in the past.
All right. Well,
sounds like it.
Well, here's a question for you. Did you guys go to Brazil and look for them?
We sent Interpol leads down there. We didn't actually go down to Brazil, but we sent Interpol leads to the Brazilian Interpol representative down there. They investigated the leads and basically and I think we actually sent one to Belize also. And nothing could be found on those individuals. Of course, a lot of these countries didn't have very accurate records back in the 60s and 70s. A lot of places, even here in the States, we've lost files through fire, through
floods, fire.
Yeah, sure.
We've heard, yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of those records from that time period, if they weren't digitized, then they're gone.
Yeah.
Fortunately, that's one of the problems we've run into this case a lot. Is it's just an old case.
What was the government's kind of attitude towards the case? I mean, you've read through all the FBI files from early on, and then obviously you took over many years after, almost 20 years after. I mean, what was the overall sentiment about this escape, and was it considered an embarrassment, or was it just something that, hey, listen, this was a something that happened, we got to rectify it, and we're going to do everything we can to find these people?
I think it was all of the above. I mean, I think it was an embarrassment. I also think they did everything. It was obvious that they thought that they had drowned in the bay, but I mean, there's thousands and thousands of pages of leads that they followed up on, even though that was one of the theories, the main theory that they had. So it's, that's the attitude of the government is, hey, there's a warrant out for these individuals, and we have to go find them, and that's really the bottom line. It's like there's no difference in this warrant than any of the other thousands and thousands of warrants that we get in every year for fugitives. I mean, the marshals and their task forces around the world and in the United States, we arrest like 100,000 fugitives, felons every single year. We've also returned thousands of children that have been reported missing. So this case is just one of many. Of course, it's obviously has a lot of historical significance to it. To me, I always say it's like the last major mystery of the 20th century, as far as true crime stuff goes.
Yeah. What was your reaction when you started going through these files and you saw the level of planning and, and all the stuff that had been done, and just the interwoven of, because it was like Alcatraz, like it was the high profile celebrity prison. You had
Right.
not only you had Whitey Bulger there, you had the Anglin brothers, you had Mickey Cohen, you had Bumpy Johnson, as well as probably a whole host of other people.
Yeah.
I mean, it just
and I'll tell you, one of the things that I've always said is that the escape occurred really because of several. It was almost like the perfect storm coming together. The facility was dilapidated. I mean, they couldn't repair it anymore. The guard force was down. They hadn't even manned several of the towers. And we were also entering the new age of rehabilitation as opposed to care and custody. And, they were trying to be a kinder, gentler prison system. And when you put all that together, I think that's why the escape occurred. And, it wasn't that long later, less than a year later, the facility closed in March of '63.
Yeah, it seemed like that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And they were like, hey, listen, this is just not working for us anymore. We got to, and I'm sure in that.
It was unbelievably expensive to keep that facility open. Everything had to be shipped out there. The guard force, it just was like really unbelievably expensive to keep it going. And from there, they moved the next max security joint to Marion, Illinois. Now it's in Florence, Colorado.
Yeah. Yeah. So Ken and Mike, when did you guys first connect with Art, and then what caused that? Was it just because when you were doing research, writing the book, or was it before that? Or tell us when that happened.
Well, actually, for me, it was in 2014. Yeah, they were getting ready, and when I say there was another production crew that was getting ready to do put together a TV series for History Channel, and it was going to be based in Seattle. It was going to be based upon a deathbed confession story that people have heard about. And I went out with my brother and another individual, Michael Esslinger, and that's the first time I ever met Art. And we were supposed to, that was really supposed to be the show. But all that kind of got changed whenever we discovered some other information, which is that, famous 1970-ish photo of John and Clarence in Brazil. And so the story kind of changed, and it went into what was currently the Alcatraz Search for the Truth, which Art was in that show with me. I'm not sure he's actually ever met Mike.
Yeah,
I think it's the first time Mike.
I met Art 20 minutes ago. That's what
20 minutes ago. Okay, cool.
But I've known Art for ever since 2014, and I worked with him. I worked with him in 2015 on the History Channel show. We went back and did another update to it in 2018.
Right.
And I've kept in touch with Art throughout the years.
Yeah.
So Art, when you saw that photo, what did you think of that photo of John and Clarence in Brazil?
I mean, the first time I saw that photo was on the show. I mean, I hadn't seen it before. I thought it was, as a U.S. Marshal, criminal investigator, special agent, whatever you want to call the federal law enforcement side, we like actionable leads. Okay, actionable leads are the key. I can't tell you, way back in the 80s and 90s, I did a lot of work on America's Most Wanted, and you'd get these leads that would come in and say, I saw him at the 7-Eleven 2 hours ago or last week. It's pretty hard to be able to investigate that type of lead. But when you've got a photograph, there's a lot of things you can do with a photograph. And based on not only the photograph, but also the Polaroid picture of Fred talking to the family, and then the audio tape that we had, we went ahead and made a transcript. It's kind of hard on the audio tape, as you remember, Ken,
I
a lot of people talking over one another at the
Yes.
table. But we were able to do a transcript as best we could of that audio, which obviously that's all actionable stuff. That's what we like. I mean, and we'll follow those leads to the end. So we look for actionable leads is what we look for.
So did you believe that they made it down to Brazil and that photograph was probably accurate and that what Fred Breezy was saying was accurate?
Till we started getting into Fred Breezy's background and learning more about him, to me, it was just an actionable lead. Whether I believed it or not, we could actually move on this particular lead, and that was the key. Believing something and corroborating it sometimes is two different things.
Sure.
So we look to corroborate everything.
Exactly. And so after I saw the TV show, they analyzed the photo. Do you believe that the photo is authentic, or do you think that the photo was faked, or what do you think about the
I think the
authenticity?
photo is authentic. But, when you start talking to forensic artists or those types of individuals, it's not a science like DNA. So you could probably put 10 of them in a room in 10 different rooms and have them come back with probably 10 different conclusions. And that's kind of like what happened here. I mean, we had one guy that said, hey, I would definitely continue this investigation. And that was a very well-known forensic artist out of California, Michael Street. But then, the guy that I was working with at the time with the Marshal Service also came up with somebody that said it wasn't them. So it's sort of okay, but you still got to follow the lead through.
How much did you know about the Anglin brothers' background when you first dove into this case in the 80s? And did the FBI have a clear-cut image of their background prior to this escape? I mean, other than their prison records, but just like, going back, because, obviously when you're, I'm sure you do profiling and say, who are these guys? Let's go deep on them. And, what we've learned through Ken and Mike's book and talking about in the podcast is that they were unique guys. They weren't like your standard ordinary, because, I've done a lot of true crime. We've done a lot of true crime. They didn't come from a bad they came from a poor background, but they didn't come from a violent background. They had a good family, God-fearing family, 14 kids. It was like, everybody can go wrong, but like their motives for first starting to steal was because they didn't have things, and then they just it escalated. But how much did you guys really look into that background?
Of course, we look into everybody's background. I mean, and I agree with you. They weren't like a violent criminal by any stretch of the imagination, but they had escaped. And the reason why they got to Alcatraz was because they had attempted escapes from other facilities. So back then in the 60s, that 50s and 60s, that's what got you to Alcatraz, is when you try to escape from a federal penitentiary or a federal prison. And that's how they got there. When you look at the background, I wouldn't say they typically would not be very high on our list of priority fugitives. Generally right now, what we prioritize, or what the marshals prioritize, are violent offenses. And that's what they go after. People wanted for murder, arson, rape, any type of aggravated assault, stuff like that. They would prioritize those cases over other cases.
So saying that they were still alive, which most likely they are not, and they were one of these leads panned out and you were able to locate them, what would happen to them today?
At this point in time, I would probably say they'd be held for a couple of days and processed out. They're in their 90s, for God's sakes. Medical bills are expensive for the federal government too, just like everybody else. And we've even had discussions with the U.S. Attorney's Office as to what they would do out in California. And in their 90s, I wouldn't mind just shaking their hand and saying, "Hey, good job." I've arrested a lot of escapees in the past, and these guys right now, obviously they've been out for a long time. So.
And what about like people that are related to them, like if they had kids or anything like that? Would there be any repercussions for any of those people, any of their children or grandchildren or anything?
No, none. No. I mean, I can't even imagine somebody trying to put a case together. And this happens a lot. I mean, we have family members, obviously, that assist, other family members in their fugitive status, and a lot of times we don't even charge those people. So I can't imagine anything would happen to any of the family members.
All right. Well, I want to dive deep into actually, because obviously, they were escape artists. They had been escaping since they were teenagers from reform schools and prisons and everything. So they were very adept at doing that. They knew how to find the weak points in any place that they were put in.
Right.
Truly very, ingenious and very, very good at doing that. So what do you think? They didn't escape. They had help. Well, I think we've all agreed, based upon all the stuff that we've been the research, it sounded like they had help both on the inside and on the outside. And so what is your feeling about the feedback, the help that they had on the inside and on the outside, specifically the Mickey Cohen connection? Specifically, it's people inside the prison.
Johnson, yeah.
Bumpy Johnson, Whitey Bulgers.
I'm going to give you the answer I give when I do any of these interviews that I've done on CNN or News Nation or whatever. Escape cases, the inmates inside have complete control over the planning and execution. The hardest part is once they leave the facility, because they have to rely generally on somebody else to assist them on the outside. I could name several cases where the escapees thought they had somebody on the outside to help them. They backed out at the last minute. 2 or 3 weeks later, we catch them in the woods somewhere. So it really, that's the hardest part for any escape is once you get out of the facility, what happens next? And usually the escapes that do occur that are successful are because they had somebody on the outside helping.
Yeah. I mean, because there's some really kind of weird stuff that went on during that time in Alcatraz, because the whole Mickey Cohen connection, he was brought in there, and then he got, he bonded out, and he was bonded out by the
only person.
Yeah. The Supreme Court justice. And and it's like, and then he was back in, and then that just right there. I mean, that seems, I don't know how. I've never heard that happen before. Have you ever heard something like that happen before? Is there anything on record where you have a Supreme Court justice who, bonds a notorious gangster out of a prison?
No.
Well, it was the Chief Justice too.
Chief Justice,
not just the Supreme Court. He was the highest guy on the Supreme Court.
Yeah. No, that has never happened. Not that I've heard of in my time. In federal cases. So I know there's a lot of weird stuff surrounding Alcatraz. Back when Alcatraz first started in the 30s and 40s, it was a pretty bad place. And what turned it around, I would say, or made it a little more livable, was the lawsuits that the inmates filed for civil rights violations, and they won those lawsuits. And Alcatraz supposedly serves some of the best food in the federal prison system. So
that's what we heard.
Yes, yeah, and you had your own cell. I mean, that's the other thing too. And they would only house, I think it was 200 to 250 inmates.
250. That's small, tiny.
That's very, very, very small. So you can see why the inmate to guard ratio when it first started was very high. But you can see for housing that many people, the cost is astronomical.
You know what's amazing is that one of the letters that I got from Whitey Bulger,
Yeah.
He's lying in a prison in Coleman, Leesburg, Florida, and he says in his letter that he would look up at the ceiling and he would wish that he was back in Alcatraz. He would reminisce about how nice it was to have his own cell and the freedom that he had, the food. And he just said that it was so much nicer. And I thought when I first read that, I was like, is this man crazy? You know, like,
well, I'll tell you,
Alcatraz being this place that no one wanted to be at, but
right,
it was crazy. He would reminisce about wanting to go back.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that and seen that written from several different inmates. I mean, obviously, being at Alcatraz was like a huge street cred thing, you know. I mean,
right.
But it was also not really a horrible place to be at if you're in prison, I guess. Yeah, it wasn't. I can tell you right now that Marion, Illinois, and Florence is not anything like that. Those people are locked down 23 hours a day in the cells by themselves, and they have a small rec yard attached to their cell, and they're let out for an hour. And if you listen to some of John Gotti's phone conversations that they had taped, and he talks about how horrible it was, being there at Florence. So it's definitely not like it used to be. Alcatraz is compared to Florence and Marion, Illinois.
Yeah, it's all push button. They let them out. They don't see no contact with anybody, and
and when they move them, it's like 3 guards on one. And I used to go to Marion, Illinois a lot because I was a deputy and started off as a deputy in St. Louis. And geez, you walk into that place and it was like you knew something bad was happening there, and you could cut the tension with a knife. And it was completely quiet. I mean, it was so quiet. It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe that was a prison facility. But
well, and then, to me, the conditions at Alcatraz backs up what Whitey also told us, that John and Clarence and Frank Morris were not escaping Alcatraz. They were escaping going back to Alabama and going back to Angola.
Yeah.
It wasn't that they disliked Alcatraz. In fact, we even got letters where John writes his mom and says how much he enjoyed being at Alcatraz and how he loved the outdoors and the Bay Area, reminding him of being home. So I don't think they were leaving Alcatraz because they didn't like it. They were leaving Alcatraz because they didn't want to go back to the state prisons that they were going to go to at some point.
They still had state time to do. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they feared going back to that prison.
Yeah.
Art, what did you think of the letters with Whitey Bulger that he sent to Ken, the correspondence?
Yeah, I mean, nice information. But Whitey's Whitey. Whitey's gonna, I'm from Massachusetts, so I'm very familiar with Whitey. I can tell you, I know plenty of people that knew Whitey Bulger personally.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I know Kevin Weeks and Pat Nee.
Right. Okay. So it's, I take it with a grain of salt. If there was something in there that I thought, okay, we got something actionable here we can run with, then we would run with it and either prove it or disprove it. Mm. So that's kind of like how I look at all that information that's coming in. I think I had gone on CNN and talked about, Whitey being killed in Springfield when the 2 brothers there beat him to death with a sock and a padlock inside of it. But it's Whitey Bulger.
I want to get back to the Mickey Cohen thing just a little bit, because just that part of this story has fascinated me ever since I've learned about it. And because there's so many kind of intertwined connections. At that point in U.S. history, there was a lot going on, obviously, a lot going on. And so was the FBI ever able to connect Mickey to the escape and anything else?
Not that I saw in any of the reports. His name came up in the reports, but I mean, God, they had they interviewed every single inmate in that prison at the time, and obviously there was 2 or 3 of them that were key. West was one of them, but and in reading some of the books that have come out, it's interesting. The Bumpy Johnson connection I found probably was more interesting to me than anything else.
How so? How so?
Well, how he supposedly helped, told his guys on the other side of the facility, because they segregated them at the time. African Americans and white prisoners were segregated. But Bumpy was aware of the whole thing and basically told his guys, keep your mouth shut. This is what's happening. And I believe that probably a lot of those guys in there would love nothing more than to thumb their nose at the federal government. And I think that was all part of it. And generally you used to find that occurring a lot more in the past. Now, you've got so many rats in prison now that it's almost impossible to plan an escape without somebody coming forward trying to cut a deal for themselves.
Yeah, I mean that the culture back there was totally different.
It's a completely different culture back there.
They would be all being unified in that attempt and
exactly
wanting it to happen. Because now it's like obviously, and they segregate themselves inside prison now.
Right.
And so I can't imagine, and that would be very useful information, almost like contraband to use to trade on if you have that kind of information.
Yeah.
But so let me throw something in about the Mickey Cohen. One of the things to me that leads credence to Mickey Cohen over someone like Bumpin' Johnson or anybody else that might have been involved in this is the fact that, and I always refer to him, people that's been on the podcast have listened to me talk about Uncle Man, or his name is actually Robert.
Right.
How in the hell did Uncle Man know Mickey Cohen? Why in the world would he go to Alfred when Alfred is in the Atlanta penitentiary serving his federal time?
Right. Why
would he go right after the escape and tell Alfred that not only did they make it, but that Mickey Cohen helped them and provided a boat for them? So, I mean, how would he even know Mickey Cohen? How would Mickey Cohen even come up in his vocabulary?
I don't know.
So to me, that lends a little bit of credence to the story. Okay.
Yeah.
But not only does that, even if you take Mickey Cohen completely out of the story here, and just the fact that he said there was a boat involved, and now we have an eyewitness that night, not just a public, not someone off the street. We're talking a San Francisco police officer who sees the boat.
Officer Chechi.
So not only do we have people that are corroborating this story that Uncle Man is telling to his brother, you also have, years later, you have Fred Breezy, who tells the exact same type story. And this is even before the FBI files ever even get released to the public.
Right.
So you can't tell me that there's not something there. I mean, to me,
I always ask you, Ken, how does that get us to where they are today? That's my question. I always tell Ken this. Ken,
this is where I always
remind everyone where they are today.
This is where I always remind people, if you ever watch the show, the movie The Fugitive, Art is the marshal that's telling the individual, I don't care if you're innocent or not, I'm here to capture you.
I don't care. I don't care.
I don't care. And by the way, we gave them that line in the movie.
I can believe that. So yeah, me and Art love to go.
Yeah,
as you can tell.
Yes.
Art, what do you think about the officer in San Francisco who saw that boat? What did you think about that lead?
I thought it was quite interesting because we had the deathbed confession that talked about a boat picking him up. We had this information come about that there was very possibly a boat, and then you got Officer Chechi, who put up with a lot of crap. Let me tell you, I think the Bureau actually looked at him for a while as possibly being involved in the escape. We did an interview with, I think Mike went out and interviewed him, right, Ken?
Michael Esplinger from the Alcatraz show went out, but Mike Lynch also went out and spoke to his daughter.
Right.
So yeah, we've had several people that have interviewed.
Right, and I actually read over the transcript just a few days ago again, and I believe he saw what he saw. Now,
Yes.
Whether it had anything to do, we're talking about San Francisco Bay, which is a pretty busy port. God, they have 30-something piers along the coastline there. So I believe what he said.
You know what is really odd about this whole story with Chechi, and we brought this up before, is that and I agree with Art, you go into, and I've read the FBI files as good as I can, the redacted version. He has the unredacted version, of course. But one of the things that struck me was the amount of interviews that the FBI did, just like Art said, with every single inmate in Alcatraz and other prisons that had any relationship to John or Clarence or Frank Morris, even state prisons.
Yes.
They interviewed every single family member, any relative, any friend, you name it, any public that came out and said, like, Art, I saw them at a gas station, or I saw them at a 7-Eleven. John's working as a bellhop in some hotel in New York. They go and interview every single one of these individuals. There is no interview whatsoever, if it doesn't exist, it's not in the current FBI files, where they ever interviewed Officer Chechi. The only time you will ever hear that anything to do with that boat is when he gives an interview with a newspaper several days later. I believe he gave it because he was being ridiculed by the FBI and being accused, as Art said, participating in it. And he wanted to get his story out. James Bennett, the director of the FBI, the director of the prisons at that time, Federal Prison Bureau, he's at that point in time in an interview, because I'm assuming whoever wrote the article went and interviewed him along with some of the special agents. But that's the first time he ever made a statement and said that the Anglin family did not have the means nor the whereabouts to provide a boat and put it in the bay every night for several weeks until the escape occurred. That's the only thing that's ever been recorded about it. So you have to ask yourself, why did they not record this in the FBI files?
It is. I think
never seen it.
Yeah. I think
I
actually have a report somewhere with the Bureau.
I have gone through it multiple times, and I have never seen it unless,
well,
like I've always said, if it's there, it's not included in what's been released to the public.
Well, let me tell you something that like I had mentioned earlier when we first started this, we only got like 4 or 5 pages of information on the whole escape. It took us years to build a file of FBI reports so that we weren't duplicating exactly what had already been done. But, I'm not casting aspersions upon any of my brother or sister agencies, but the FBI and the marshals, especially in the 80s and 90s, didn't get along too well. Let's put it that way.
Well, and I gather they didn't share a whole lot of information. So, for you to get only 3 or 4 pieces.
They collect, they don't share.
Exactly. Because I'm like, it
took us years to get a lot of those files. And I think that a lot of the files are missing anyway. I think
missing.
Some key ones.
Well, they're from 1962. God,
Well, so you go back to what we were talking about just then. All of the interviews that they did with the prisoners and the family members, you will not find, if they ever did it, it's not included in what I've read. They never interviewed Alfred. Alfred has never been interviewed. Alfred, the third brother, the one that Uncle Man goes to visit, tells him that that they made it, tells him about Mickey Cohen. Also, Alfred is the one that the brothers sent information during the planning stage when he's still in Atlanta and told them they were planning an escape from Alcatraz. So he knew about it even before the escape occurred. But the point is, they never interviewed him. So here you have Officer Chechi. The interview is not in the FBI files that I've ever seen. You don't have Alfred's interview that's ever in the FBI files. You would have there's of all the people that would have interviewed, they would have interviewed him.
Chechi's interview are in the FBI files.
Okay, so it's just not. It just wasn't released.
Included in what was released.
It just wasn't put out to public. I've seen multiple reports of the interview with Alfred. Not multiple reports, but there's 2 or 3 reports in there that they went to the facility and interviewed him. And
but they didn't release it to the public.
Yeah, it hasn't. I don't know why. You got to talk to the FBI about that. And good luck, by the way.
Yeah,
you are going to
trust me. I'm going down that road right now.
Yeah, good luck on that. And oddly enough, they turned everything over to the National Park Service. So we've had to work with the National Park Service to get a lot of the original stuff that was in their cells and that they had the evidence that they did found in the bay. So all that is in the custody of the Park Service. And in fact, I think even some of it is in the Ronald Reagan Library. They loaned it out to the presidential library, Reagan's presidential library.
Ooh, I'll have to. That's close to me. I'll have to go check out, see if it's there.
They've got 1 or 2 items, and I can't recall which ones they were, but it was something that was found in the cells, I think. But I do know the Park Service did tell me that there were some items that were loaned out to the Reagan Library.
So much for evidence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So at what point do you think they'll, if they ever, declassify all that and just release it all, or where they just don't even really care?
I think the FBI doesn't care, because the case isn't really theirs anymore. But obviously they have all the original stuff, or they have the original files, whatever wasn't turned over. I will say that the stuff that was turned over to the Park Service wasn't any of their reporting stuff, but it was stuff that was found in the cells, evidence that was found in the water, stuff like that got turned over to the Park Service.
Yeah, which is
well, not everything, right?
Well, everything that I saw.
Well, I mean, the paintings were not.
Oh, that
over.
yeah.
Personal
I don't think
items,
I ever saw the paintings.
Yeah, the personal items. Well, they only sent home, and I have the inventory cards that were sent home with the items. And for John, they his listed a pair of glasses, 2 paintings. I believe it had to do with a Christmas card. That was about it. And then with Clarence, it was a believe it or not, a paintbrush, an artist paintbrush. They kept John's, but they sent Clarence's home. And with Clarence, they sent one painting. So Clarence painted 1 painting and John painted 2 paintings. Right. None of their personal letters that the family wrote them, nor any of the photos that were in the letters have ever been returned back to the family, which is what I'm trying to get to now.
Yeah, they probably won't be either.
And why?
I would say, well, I don't know. You might end up getting them 10 years from now. I don't know.
But why would they not give the letters back? I mean, what possible reason could there be that my grandmother wrote a letter?
You have to ask the FBI.
There you go.
I have been trying to. Believe me, I have been trying to.
Well, hey, Art, I want to ask you one question, because when you first took over the case, you say you were given just a handful of reports, not hardly anything. I mean, what is that like from an investigator? You're tasked with something. You're tasked with something that happened in the past that has a lot of that was high profile at the time, and still kind of it's part of the gestalt. Everything that's going on. It's still hanging on the story, because it's just obviously they still give tours of Alcatraz. It's a main part of the tour. I mean, for you as an investigator, when you're tasked with this, and then you're given no information, I mean, what is that like? That's got to be really, and you know that it's there. You know, there's a lot of information.
Oh yeah, you just start from scratch, and you know, we try not to do that, but in this particular case, we had no other option. And you just start digging from scratch. There's some basic things that we all do when you start in particularly an escape investigation. Usually, there's a ton of reports that, you know, pre-sentence investigation stuff or stuff from the courts that we could easily get. You know, we've got a lot of psychological profiles on Frank Morris when he was a teenager, a young teenager. So we have a lot of that stuff that we could get from the Bureau of Prisons or from the courts. And that's kind of like where you start. Okay, who's got some info on these particular individuals? Today, it's a lot easier. You get a federal escape today, and generally the probation office has a huge file on that individual because they do a huge investigation before that individual is actually sentenced. And they go back and they dig. They do a great job at sort of providing an investigator like me looking at a particular escape a ton of information to go through and look at.
Interesting, because I just think it's got to be incredibly hard when you're competing with another organization within the government for information when they want you to kind of move forward with it, yet they'll just spoon feed you what they want to give you. And it's almost like, well, obviously we're seeing a lot of that now as well. It doesn't go away. I mean, the spoon feeding and the misdirection just to kind of, all right, let's just get it through the news cycle for now. People, there'll be something else that'll prop up. They'll forget about this.
Exactly.
And, you know, i.e., you know, the Epstein crap that's going on and all this other stuff that's going on. It just gets swept under the rug.
It's a long list, I'll tell you that.
A long list. And I'm sure, yeah. And I'm sure a lot of it, it's an up at dawn, pride swallowing siege for people like yourself who work so hard and tirelessly, you know, doing the good work and feeling like, all right, well, why don't you just handcuff me some more?
Right.
You know?
Well, I'll tell you, in this particular case, I was investigating tons of other cases. This just wasn't the one case that I had for 25 years. I mean, I worked on a ton of cases. This particular case I would do sort of on my own after hours. If a lead came up, you know, I sort of ran with it separately from all the other stuff I was doing. Of course, there were several cases that took a lot of my time up. And I would have to put the Alcatraz escape case aside because we do prioritize cases. Sure. Listen, the Alcatraz escapees, you know, weren't out killing people. You know, they weren't murdering people. They weren't on a crime spree. They weren't committing terrorist attacks. So, you know, we had people that we were looking for that actually had done all the above. So those were the ones that we would concentrate our efforts on. And then I would work on the Alcatraz escape case basically separately from all that other stuff I was doing.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm sure. I mean, it happens every day with investigators. They're packed with cases and they got to prioritize. I mean, we're following 2 or 3 cold cases right now. And we talk to, you know, government agencies and they just keep on around to say, listen, you know, this is not the only case I have, you know,
exactly.
Case files got I got about 150 other cases.
Right.
And, you know, if you give me if you find something, you give it to me, I'll follow up on it. But, you know, the bandwidth is low.
It is. It's sad, but it's low. I mean, it's just so sad. I mean, what's happening. I think we've got 250,000 open homicide cases, you know, around the country that have been open for quite a while. I think only about 65% of homicide cases that occur every year actually get solved. Yeah. So that 40% keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and just adds to the you know, the back file, the cold cases. So, and that's just homicides. You know, missing persons. They're all in the same boat. Yeah. No, missing persons even bigger. It's like 600,000. Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, it's crazy, the missing person cases. And I mean, you haven't even talked about what's happening on the reservations either.
I was going to say the indigenous ones even exploding because we're working with the BIA on a case right now.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I'm glad to see. I've seen a few of those types of cases come up on TV, and I'm glad to see they're actually profiling a lot of that stuff now.
Well, yeah, they took it over from the OSBI in Oklahoma because they were just not doing anything.
Right.
And they actually were listening to our podcast and they said, we got to take this over because they're just. Unfortunately, one of the victims was part Chickasaw,
Right.
and they've been doing a lot of great work on it, and they're making some movement. So that's fantastic.
And there's a lot of weird rules regarding reservations, and we used to do a lot of work on reservations, but it would basically be either they invited us in, BIA or the tribal police invited us in, or we had a federal court order to go in and do whatever.
All right. Well, listen, I want to talk to you and I don't want to take so much more of your time, and we really appreciate it, but I want to get your opinion on what you really think happened and whether or not you think they made it to Brazil, and whether or not, because we're looking into this on another level too, and we're kind of really diving deep. We're doing some work down in Brazil right now and working with people and trying to kind of connect the tissue, find family members, and we're getting close. And in fact, just to give you, yeah, in fact, because they, according to what we've learned, that they both got married, they both had kids.
Right.
One had 3, one had 4.
Mm-hmm.
One of their kids or grandkids is a dead ringer for Ken, a friggin' dead ringer, and it's just so we're working with genealogists and DNA people down there. We were able to find somebody who actually lives there, who actually can pull the information for us because we couldn't do it from here. And so just wanted to find out what you think and whether or not, did you read the book? Have you read the book yet? That Ken and
No.
Okay.
No.
I'd really love to have you on after you read it because there's so much in there that these guys pulled out. And, we're talking to a bunch of different people right now about this book. And it's literally the escape. Like when you look at the Clint Eastwood movie, it's like a thimbleful of the information of what that highlighted that escape and how they kind of used Frank Morris as the mastermind. And we know from Ken talking to the writer and why he did that, because we only had Clint Eastwood, so we had to make it somebody. So it was like a random choice. But when you dive deep down to this and learn about the family history, and you see how these guys thought and how good at they were and prolific at their escapes and their planning, and they weren't 2 farm boys. What do you think really happened, and if they did make it?
I think they escaped off the island, but I think they drowned in San Francisco Bay because I have yet to come across any viable piece of evidence to show otherwise. And if you've got something, if you want to share it, that's fantastic. We will investigate it, but there's just been nothing that I've come across to prove otherwise that they originally thought that they drowned in the bay.
Mm-hmm. But you even said yourself there's no bodies.
Right.
There was bodies flown up. We lived right on the Hudson in New Jersey, right across from Manhattan, and they're constantly finding bodies floating up.
Yeah, but that San Francisco Bay is a little different. There is a percentage of bodies that the PD says, when somebody commits suicide off the bridge, how many do wash up and how many get sucked out into that area outside of San Francisco Bay.
Yeah.
I don't know.
How
Show me something. Show me something.
How many of them would you find if they were wearing life vests? If they drowned, wouldn't you think they would still be in their life vest?
Not necessarily.
They didn't find but one life vest.
Yeah.
And it was still inflated. It was still inflated.
No, they tested them. They were
very well put together. I always say this. I'll go in to say that I've had people challenge me about what the evidence, or they didn't believe that they made it, just like Art. And I always ask, why do you believe that? What piece of evidence that the FBI were able to collect back then what piece of evidence do you stand on to back up your theory that they didn't make it?
The investigation from 1962 up until now. That's what I rely on.
No, I'm talking about like you say a piece of evidence. I like, for instance, if someone said, well, I believe it this way, I don't believe they made it.
Right.
I always want to know, okay, everybody can believe something, right? Everybody's got a theory.
Yeah.
But is there any evidence that you've ever seen that you could say, well, this proves that they didn't make it?
Yes.
What?
The investigation from 1962 until now. I'm not going to change.
Come on.
I mean, Jesus,
Come on,
thousands
Art.
and thousands of pages of reports.
Yeah, but none of them
Investigation.
ever.
Listen, the hardest thing to do is to keep a conspiracy, right?
None of them.
That's the hardest thing.
None of those investigations. And I read them too.
Yeah.
None of them
You
ever
haven't read
come
all.
back and
You haven't
say,
read all of them, Ken. You haven't read all of them.
I've read every one. Well, if you'll give
But
me
you
the
can
ones
get your
I haven't
hands
read,
on. I have
will
all
be
the
happy
original
to read
stuff.
them. If you will give me the ones that I haven't read, I'll be happy to read them. I just go back into like this, let's go back to that. But I know we're almost out of time, but let's go back to that photo. Okay. The photo that to me is the only piece of evidence other than if you can show me something that would back up that they actually made it. Now we've had that photograph. The very first person that ever looked at it was Michael Street. He was a friend of Art. I never had met Michael at that time. Michael interviewed it or looked at it. There was another clip of an FBI person that did the facial recognition on Clarence. They didn't use it in the show. I actually saw the clip. I don't know whatever happened to it. But over the years, we've had 5 independent companies that have come to me and say, can we analyze this for this particular show? Can we do this for this show? I always say, absolutely yes. They all come back with the exact same scenario, that it comes in like 99, 97, 98% match. None of them will ever say 100.
It's like what I told you before. Put 10 of them in 10 different rooms, and you're going to come up with a different. We found one guy.
I'll tell you what. I'll challenge you right now. Let's get 10 and let's do it.
Don't do that. Don't do that. You got a bet. You have a bet with Eric, don't you?
But let's go
you have a bet with Eric.
Right? Let's go back to Expedition Unknown. They hired, and we didn't do it. Me and Mike didn't do it.
Right.
That show hired the most leading facial recognition company that was out there in 2022. This company was doing work for the U.S. government on facial recognition software, tracking down people that had been trafficked. They're the ones who came back and said it was a 99.7% match on John Anglin. That is John Anglin in that photograph. Would you believe it if they came back and said it was 99.9? Is 99.7 not good enough?
All right. Hey, all right.
Unless you give me DNA.
All right. Well, we're working on the DNA.
We're working on the DNA.
We're working on the DNA.
We're working on the
DNA, and then
we're working on that.
Okay. All right. So
obviously we've got the DNA that you guys provided to us too.
Exactly.
Yeah, we're gonna get some from some family.
Here's another question. I have like a scenario here. All right. So you've seen all the unredacted files, correct?
Right.
Okay. So obviously Ken has only seen what was given to him, and what was given to him was redacted. We've seen some of those files redacted. To me at this point, why not unredacted, release the unredacted files? There's no big case here as far as there's no threat to, safety. There's no threat to anything other than just people's reputations. Most of the people involved in this case are dead, that were investigating this.
They're not all dead, right? No.
Okay. I agree. They're up there but I don't understand at this point, because you're pretty steadfast in your position based upon all the.
I'm only waiting for evidence. That's what I'm waiting for.
I know, but based upon everything that you've written that was unredacted, and then you went over everything, like obviously you have your purview is way more focused than ours, because these guys have done amazing research and interviewed a bunch of people, got the Whitey Bulger letters, and gotten a lot of inside information. But you guys have the interpretation of the investigation files
Right.
based upon what the facts of how, you know, we know how these ports are. We have family friends that are, you know, government officials and police officers. What's written in a report is just that person's perspective on what they actually saw and what they, you know, acquired.
Right.
You know, there's no opinion. There's no, you know, speculation. Right. There's none of that. So it's data.
Right.
So is there anything that has been redacted that you feel like could be unredacted that would at least benefit? Okay. So there, that's what I think.
I think you're not. The government is very hesitant on a lot of what they call personally identifying PII. So, which is personally identifying information on a particular individual.
Yeah.
So whether it, you know, because when you look at a lot of those reports, there's names, dates of birth, social security numbers, addresses, stuff like that.
Well, yeah, I mean that stuff's always going to be
very sensitive to that type of stuff.
Yeah, but
I don't think there's anything in any of those reports that couldn't be openly put out, other than that type.
Or at least give me a copy of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. All right. Well, listen, we'd love to, you know, have you read the book, and we'd love to have you back on, because I think, you know, I've only had.
I'll send you a copy, Art.
Okay.
And because it does really cover it really well, and we've been going over it in detail in this, and we'll continue. And like I said, our work is not done here, and hopefully, you know, we can provide you some more information to change your mind.
Absolutely. I'm open to it. Right, Ken? I've always been open to anything.
Yeah. Just
we're
going to drag him along onto the believing side, onto the light side, you know, from the dark side. Exactly. We're going to drag him over there kicking and screaming at some point down.
I don't know. I won't be kicking and screaming. You know, I love going on trips with you, right?
Oh, yes.
Well, that may happen too, because we got a bunch of things in the works right now. So we may drag you with us.
Keep your bags packed.
All right. You're always packed, Ken. You know that.
It was so nice to meet you, Art.
It's great to meet you all. And
all right.
I will start marking up your book.